Hey everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Introductory to CIS Security Framework. My name is Mark Jennings. I'm with OTX Partners, and I am thrilled to have Phyllis Lee of the Center for Internet Security here to go over the CIS framework and how it can be applied. But first, a little bit of logistics here. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the chat. And this presentation is being recorded, so it'll be available online after the event. Now, this is the second part of our cyber series that we started last month. So throughout the next year, we're going to be going over all the major cybersecurity frameworks and things like how the shared responsibility model works into how MSPs work with their clients for compliance. And we'll talk about how selling cybersecurity is an important part of this, and even things like how to build a cybersecurity focused culture. So please join us every month for these things as we go along. Again, I am thrilled to have Phyllis Lee from the Center for Internet Security to go over the controls today. She is the Senior Director of Controls. So Phyllis Lee is the Senior Director of Controls for the Center of Internet Security. She has over 25 years of experience in the information assurance and has performed vulnerability assessments, virtualization research, and worked in security automation. Prior to joining CIS, Ms. Lee worked for the National Security Agency, focusing on the intersection between malware and virtualization, which included collaboration with MIT Lincoln Labs. She also participated in a variety of security automation standardization efforts and led the security automation strategy for the NSA Information Assurance Directorate. Ms. Lee graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a Master in Science in Computer Science. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phyllis, and I'm going to get her presentation lined up here. So just bear with me for 1 second.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I have just, as an FYI, I'll do my intro now. I worked at the NSA for 25 years. I spent the bulk of my time on the defensive side. I loved working at the NSA. Next slide, please. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide. Yeah, so I've been promoted since my bio. Sorry, so I'm the VP of Content Development. So that means that the CIS Critical Security Controls, our CIS benchmarks, and our cloud team fall under me within security best practices. I spent 25 years at the NSA. I loved my time there. I've been here at CIS for around 7 years. It's hard to believe. What's funny about my background is I left the NSA because I wanted to, have a job with more flexibility that I could work at home. And literally less than a year later, we had a pandemic. And it worked out so well for me because my children were much younger at the time in elementary school and middle school. So I was able to be at home while they were in school. And we all stretched our internet bandwidth like nobody's business. So I'm a mom of 2. I have some hobbies. One of my main ones, of course, is chauffeuring my children around. Next slide, please.
Come on, there we go.
There we go. So let me tell you a little bit about the Center for Internet Security. We're a small nonprofit, and the bulk of what we provide is free. So we have 2 sides of the house, I'd like to say, the MSISAC and EIISAC. So the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center and the Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So those 2 organizations, EIISAC falls under MSISAC, provide threat prevention, protection, as well as security advisories and incident response for the MSISAC SLTT entities, so state, local, tribal, and territorial government entities. The EIISAC, Elections Infrastructure ISAC, provides those same services to elections infrastructure. So while elections are state-run, they actually, have a separate infrastructure, and so that's why you have the 2 different ISACs. The MSISAC and EIISAC are fully funded by the federal government. They're the only ISAC that is. So it's funded through DHS and managed by CISA. One other commentary about EIISAC, it's fairly new. It's existed since 2016, since there was a lot of press around the elections at that time. I always like to mention that no results were modified during the US elections. However, consumer confidence was extremely affected. And so, of course, the government set up the EIISAC, and we're here to help secure those elections. The other side of the house is the security best practices, and that's where I work. We create the content for the CIS, like I said earlier, critical security controls, benchmarks, and our cloud team. And everything that we create is consensus-based, and we work through communities of SMEs, subject matter experts. Next slide, please. So now I want to just kind of give an overview of cybersecurity frameworks and where do the CIS critical security controls fall in there? Because I get this question asked a lot. Next slide. So there are like 3 bins of cybersecurity frameworks. And so you can see here, I'll go from the smaller, I guess, to larger, or the more specific to the less specific. So controls frameworks are like, what we just say here. They describe the actions that organizations should take and are the foundation for any cybersecurity program. And so underneath here would be the CIS Critical Security Controls, the 800-53, and the -171, of which CMMC is based upon. I know there's a lot of interest around CMMC from this group. And then we have program frameworks, which you can see they provide the structure for evaluating your security program and as well as communicating your security program across your organization. And some examples would be ISO 27001 and the NIST CSF. And then finally, we have risk frameworks. So those are those frameworks that provide a consistent approach for managing and assessing risk in a way that provides value to the business. We always talk about what's the cyber risk to the business risk, right? Because I noticed on your slide as well is like, how to get funding, and that really is, and how to convince other organizations to invest in cyber. And it's really about how do you explain cyber risk to the business? Because most people know what it means to run their organization and those risks. Examples of risk frameworks are ISO 27005, and we have our own CIS risk assessment methodology. And so really, we recommend organizations pick frameworks from all 3 of these categories as you mature your security or cybersecurity program as you move along towards your maturity. Next slide. And so what are the CIS critical security controls? So they started off, as I like to say, kind of like warm fuzzy in our tummies, right? It started off really at the National Security Agency. At that time, the DoD was wondering how it is that I should spend money on cyber. And so the NSA came up with a top 10 list. That was overtaken by SANS. We handed it over to SANS. They had the megaphone and they pushed it out to all their followers. And then that became the SANS top 20. Today, we have 18 controls and it's fully created by CIS and our volunteer organizations. The controls are comprised of technical and procedural activities that help organizations defend against top threats. Next slide, please. And so, of course, one of the frameworks that most people know about is the NIST cybersecurity framework. So there was a presidential order in 2013 that asked organizations to follow a voluntary standard, which was created by NIST. It is very popular, of course, in the US. Some people overseas um, also follow it. NIST CSF 2.0 was just recent released last year in, I think, like January or February. And what they did was add the new security function govern, which I think was really nice because you had the top five, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And then when they added govern, they put govern all the way around the wheel to show that you really need governance across all these different security functions. Many people say, hey, NIST CSF is written at a high level. It's hard for me to understand what to implement or how to satisfy this. It was written that way on purpose so that it could cover all the critical infrastructure. And they look to other frameworks like the -53, as well as the CIS Critical Security Controls to help organizations implement the CSF. Next slide, please. Many of you are probably familiar with the ISO 27000 series created by the International Organization for Standardization. A lot of people get certified or accredited against the ISO 27000 series, and then you can see the different series down there. Of course, I think the ones that we are probably most familiar with is the 27001 and the 27002. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to go over FISMA, which was a law. And, FISMA is for any organization that has access or is obligated to protect U.S. government information. And so you have to be compliant with FIPS 199, the FIPS 200, and of course it looks to the -53 for those security controls. And depending on how you look at the FIPS 199 determines what impact level you are going to have to implement, and then that guides the 800-53 controls that you will use. Next slide, please. And so I often get asked, what's the difference between CIS and NIST? So you see the two different levels. One's programmatic, one is more tactical because we're the controls. Within the NIST CSF, you have the different implementation tiers. We've got 3 implementation groups, which is our prioritization, which I'll go into later. You have to do a risk assessment for the CSF. We've built ours in our controls, and I'll tell you about that later. I'll go into more detail. And CSF is really about your business. What vertical are you in? What are your business drivers? Versus what we have done is we've looked at the top cybersecurity threats and we've prioritized based on that. Next slide, please. If you look at the ISO 27002, you'll see again the different levels. The 27000 series, or 1 and 2, are a programmatic framework similar to the CSF. They don't have a low, medium, or high prioritization or tiering system. However, it does want you to do a risk assessment, and that really guides what you implement. Next slide, please. And if we look at FISMA, which is a risk framework, again, you're using those other FIPS documents to select your impact level. That guides your -53 implementation. And then typically you look at a third-party GRC tool to help, kind of grade yourself against FISMA. I will say for us and the controls, we do provide free tooling, CSAT hosted. We do have a paid version. I'll go into what those are later. And of course, we have our implementation groups for prioritization. Next slide, please. So let's look at what that means across different frameworks. So you look at asset inventory. So pretty much every framework has asset inventory. And so I think, some of it is like there is extreme overlap over the different frameworks, and there's so many frameworks out there. We call it the fog of more here at CIS. because we know that organizations are buckling under the pressure of all the different regulatory frameworks that they are subject to. And so as an MSP or as a service provider, I know it's like, okay, what is it that you can implement to show, compliance perhaps across multiples, since your clients may be dealing with different regulatory frameworks. And so here's just an example of what it reads like and what it looks like across the different frameworks. And you can read these yourself, but what you can see is, like at CIS, it's more specific, even at the control or safeguard level. That's 1.1. And then again, you see how it is, again, more specific when you look at our second example. It's not really a direct one-to-one mapping, as you can see using the language. We do provide mapping as a free service, but I just wanted to show you this is how, the work that someone has to do when you're looking at compliance across the different kinds of frameworks. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to go into some more detail about the CIS Critical Security Controls. Next slide, please. So we are a globally recognized cybersecurity standard. Around 60% of our downloads are outside of the US. Like I said, it's a prioritized set of actions that organizations can implement to help defend against top threats. Our latest version is version 8.1, and we released that last year. And the big push for releasing that was to make sure that we kept in line with the NIST CSF. Many organizations look to controls as a way to implement the CSF. And since CSF added the govern function, we thought it was important that we also map to the govern function, because a lot of the procedural actions that we have in the controls really speak to that govern. Next slide, please. And so how were the controls created? I gave a little bit of history earlier where it was just, a group of people, subject matter experts, creating a top 10 list for the DoD. Then it migrated over to SANS, who put it on their megaphone, and they got the opinions of thousands of subject matter experts. And now we're here in this like third, fourth, and fifth block where we're really trying to back our choices by data. We're looking at how can we test these? How do we know that these safeguards and controls that we've written down in the critical security controls can really defend against real world threats? Next slide, please. And so here's how we do our work at CIS. We look at the different attack summaries. Of course, I said we have the MSISAC and EIISAC. This is the operational arm of the CIS. And we look at threat summaries really around the world, since we do have worldwide adoption. We summarize them. We have the community defense model that we created that I'll go into more detail later. And that really informs our security best practices, our controls, our benchmarks, and our hardened images, which are our, we provide in the different CSPs, instances of different technologies like Windows or Linux hardened to our CIS benchmarks. But, this is really just to say that we really look at current data, current threat data, to make sure that our best practices are informed by recent attacks to show that, you can defend against threats, the top threats, excuse me, that are happening when you implement our best practices. Next slide. Oh, by the way, I can't see the questions, so if anyone has any questions, or if Mark or Jeff, you can interrupt me whenever. I see some things in the chat. So here's a look. Right now we have the top 18 controls. You'll see that these are written in priority order. We also have our other prioritization implementation groups, which cuts across this prioritization, and I'll go more into that later. But I just want to point out that the top 3, which is really what we'd like to say is know your environment. These are critical to any cybersecurity program. You need to know what hardware assets you have, what software assets you have, and really what it is, what sensitive data that you have that you need to protect, and then apply the remaining controls, accordingly. And the data has also shown us that Control 4, the number one thing you can do to help defend against top threats, is to have a secure configuration, which of course we provide through our CIS benchmarks. Next slide, please. We also have, because of the work that we've done, a lot of external recognition about the efficacy of the controls to defend against top threats. So a couple years ago, I worked with the IST Ransomware Task Force. They landed on CIS Critical Security Controls as the best defense for ransomware for small, medium enterprises. And you can read that paper. We've been working with the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report now for a few years, and they point to the CIS Critical Security Controls as a way to mitigate against all the threats mentioned in that report. A little tidbit from that report, I know we have MSPs on here, and you are also help defending small, medium businesses or small, medium enterprises. I believe last year's report, normally there's a call out in the section for small, mediums, and they say, hey, these are the top threats that you're facing. This is how you should actually defend your networks. Last year in that section, they said, hey, small, mediums, you're facing the same attacks as large enterprises. So instead, what they did is they talked about implementation group 1 of the CIS Critical Security Controls to say, hey, here are the things that you should be implementing. So I thought that was interesting because a lot of times small, mediums think that they aren't facing the same attacks as the large enterprises. And then this last bullet is just pointing to how more and more organizations are getting sued as more and more breaches are occurring. The citizens of this nation have an expectation that their data is being protected, that some things should remain private. And so this lawsuit in Tennessee was named the CIS Critical Security Controls as a framework that was not implemented by this hospital, but had they implemented the CIS Critical Security Controls, they could have shown that they did reasonably implement a cybersecurity program. But since they did not, they were negligent in protecting the data that was lost through an attack. Next slide. And so what are the benefits of the controls? Really, I think, one of the biggest benefits is that it's prioritized and it's specific. And we really tried to do that because that's a lot of the feedback that we've been getting is that, hey, I need to know where to start. I don't know what this control or the supporting safeguard means. And so what we tried to do, and hopefully succeeded, is to make sure that everything we write down in our controls and supporting safeguards is specific, it's measurable, and organizations understand what they need to do in order to implement that control. And of course, it's prioritized. Next slide. And as you can see, that's one of the goals. One ask per safeguard is also important. So what happens, as you know, if you read another framework, they'll say, oh, we just have this many controls. But oftentimes, one control may ask for several things. And so we really tried to avoid that. And of course, it is backed by data, as I'll show later. Next slide. So what are our implementation groups? We always hear, what's the least amount I can do? What's the least amount I can do? And I understand that because everybody is strapped for resources. I get that from small, medium organizations as well as large enterprises. They want to do the least amount and get, the biggest bang for their buck. And so what we did was, excuse me, we created implementation groups. So implementation group 1, we call it essential cyber hygiene. Those are the must-do safeguards that any enterprise, regardless of size, should implement to protect against top threats. When we also looked at implementation group 1, not only the security value or the efficacy of that safeguard to defend against those threats, but also how easy or hard is it to implement that safeguard, and how foundational is it, and how resource intensive is it, which goes into how hard or how easy. So, and of course, how foundational. So for example, having an asset inventory, hardware asset inventory policy, of course, is not easy for anyone, large or small. However, it is foundational. And so that is an implementation group 1. And some could argue that if you're a small enterprise, it's easier to have a hardware asset management policy. Implementation group 2 is geared towards larger organizations that are subject to some threats, and of course, some regulatory frameworks that comprises the largest set of additional safeguards. So it's IG1 safeguards, the 56, plus an additional 74. And that, of course, is for those organizations facing those more threats. And then implementation group 3 is comprised of all the CIS controls and safeguards. And those are really for those large enterprises that are probably targeted, like a big bank, and subject to dozens and dozens of regulatory frameworks. Next slide. And so we ask organizations to decide what implementation group you are in. Of course, what I didn't point out is really the sensitivity of the data that you're responsible for. So for example, if you are a small mom and pop shop, however, you're responsible for highly sensitive data because let's say you're a DoD contractor, you are obligated to protect that data if it is highly sensitive. So you might have to implement IG2 or IG3. It's really something that you need to decide for yourself. But of course, regardless, even if you're unsure, start with IG1. Next slide. And now I want to talk about the risk assessment methodology. So we know that all organizations, again, regardless of size, probably can't implement a cybersecurity framework all in total, right? These large enterprises tell me, how do I prioritize? What do I do? Of course, we provide the implementation groups, but we also have a risk assessment methodology. And it's what is reasonable for an organization to implement. CIS RAM has worksheets. We've really simplified it so that you can do a self-assessment pretty, I wouldn't say quickly, but in an as easy as manner as you can. CIS RAM, I've just lost my train of thought. I apologize. So yeah, so we provide the tools that you need in order to do a risk assessment to help you decide how you implement your cybersecurity program. Oh, and what CIS RAM does, which I think is nice, is it requires an organization to think about what's the harm to myself, which most people do think about, but also what's the harm to others. If something happens to my network and I'm compromised, what's the harm to others? Next slide. Yeah. And so what we're seeing, and like I said earlier, is this expectation of data privacy. And so when you look at federal cybersecurity law, and you can see this over the years, I won't read this chart to you, you'll see that it's really geared towards a certain vertical like healthcare, or geared towards organizations that are going to be doing business with the federal government. Next slide. And so what we see now, though, as I showed you in my prior example, but also here, is that more and more lawsuits are being used or are being prosecuted, or people are being taken to court for not adequately protecting an organization's data. And here's just an example where the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia listed the CIS risk assessment methodology as an example of a way that you can show that you've implemented a reasonable cybersecurity program. Next slide, please. Oh, I do want to, sorry, go back. I do want to point out this fourth bullet that a reasonable risk is a risk posed by a safeguard must be less than or equal to the risk it protects against. So that's also another fundamental principle in CIS RAM. So for example, I am not obligated to perform a pen test if performing a pen test, say it's $40,000, $60,000, is going to bankrupt my business, right? And so that's what I think is important also about the CIS RAM. It's not you must implement everything. It's, hey, if I'm at risk of going out of business, it's not reasonable for me to implement that safeguard. Next slide. And so here are the different states that have state privacy law. And again, it's just to show that more and more people are expecting that their data is not compromised, and states are recognizing that through legislation. Next slide, please. And so what we're seeing are 5 states enacting cybersecurity legislation around the protection of the obligation of an organization to protect people's data. Next slide. And so what is it that's in the cybersecurity law? You can see that you have to protect the security and confidentiality of information. And what the laws are taking into consideration are the size and complexity of the organization, the resources they have to protect that data, as well as the sensitivity of the information. And so this is really interesting. We have 5 states that have passed this legislation, but more are on the way. And so we observe that, and we're taking note of that. Next slide, please. And so these safe harbor statutes reference different cybersecurity frameworks, of which CIS Critical Security Controls is one of the frameworks. In fact, my boss, Kurt Dukes, testified in the state of Connecticut when that legislature was enacting or debating enacting that legislation, and it passed. Next slide. I do want to say one thing. And so what we did do, and I think I say it later, is we created a paper on reasonable cybersecurity. What does it mean to implement reasonable cybersecurity? Of course, that's around the critical security controls, and that is free for download. Next slide, please. And so we talk about the controls ecosystem, and it's not about the list. And what does that mean? We know that many organizations have different options for what, controls program or what framework you want to implement. And regardless of what program or what cybersecurity framework you decide to implement, because as you saw earlier, there are a lot of good lists and there's a lot of overlap within those lists. What we want to make sure is that whatever list you pick, it has the ecosystem around it for you to actually implement that list and the supporting structure. And so here are some of the questions that we often get asked. And what we try to do is make sure that we can answer them. And I do want to point out like an example of where we are so lucky that we get to talk with different organizations. So we speak with a lot of K-12. As you know, during the pandemic, K-12 went virtual. And so the IT staff went from supporting maybe just a few hundred organizations. You can go back, this slide. A few hundred folks, and mainly teachers and administrators, to thousands, right? Including, and the bulk of them children. And so the state of Michigan was offering a discount on assessments against CIS Critical Security Controls Implementation Group 1. And we spoke with the K-12 organization in there, and they're like, we failed every .1, which is that maps to that govern function, which is have a policy, hardware asset management policy, software asset management policy, data management policy, so on and so forth. And what we saw was that, you're not the only school, and you're probably not the only organization that has never created these policies. And so we created policy templates. And, that kind of goes into that, what resources do I have? How do I implement? And so that's, one of the luxuries of working at CIS is that we talk with a lot of organizations And as we talk with them, we get to build out our ecosystem. We get to provide those things that organizations need, and templates is one of them. And they are very popular, and we have hundreds of downloads of those templates every month. Next slide, please. Of course, we're referenced by industry standards, our CIS benchmarks, which are our secure configuration guides, are mentioned in PCI, for example, to show compliance, which of course PCI says you must have a secure configuration. We understand that many organizations, again, are looking to comply with other regulatory frameworks. So you'll see the mappings that the CIS controls provide to the different regulatory frameworks. Next slide. And so how did we come about with our prioritization? So we have something called the community defense model. And what we did was look at worldwide threat reports, dozens and dozens. And we said, okay, what are the top 5 threats that all organizations are facing? And like I said, last year's Verizon data breach report said, regardless of your size, everyone's facing these same top threats. And we've distilled them down into these top 5 threats after looking internationally. And then we looked at our community and said, okay, what do you all think about this? You know, how do you feel about the way we prioritize? And oh, I skipped a step. We looked at those threat reports. We created those attack patterns, for example, ransomware, using the MITRE attack framework. And those attack patterns were donated to us by different organizations. Like, we did not have to do that, so that was great. And then we looked at mapping our safeguards or subcontrols to MITRE mitigations as mitigations to those attack techniques that are used in those different attack patterns. Yes, and so here you have the, you can go to the next slide. And here what you have is the summary of our results. And what you'll see is if you implement implementation group 1, you can defend against the top 5 attack types. These attack types names are from Verizon Data Breach Report. Different attack summaries sometimes name them differently. The only difference, or the only time we deviated from Verizon Data Breach Report, is we pulled ransomware out of malware, because ransomware is bundled up into malware. But because of the importance of ransomware, the effects of it, and the fact that we get asked so many times, how can we best defend against ransomware, we pulled that out into its separate category. And you can see if you implement implementation group 3, you can have a better defense against the top threats. And also what you can see is, you know, these attack techniques are used across not just these 5 different attack types, but multiples of attack types. And so implementing implementation group 1 really allows you to defend against several attack types. Next slide. And so this is a tool that we have on our website. Again, it's free, so you can map to other frameworks. And you can see you can pick your implementation group, you can pick what other framework you want to map to, and then it just shows it to you in a website, on a web page. Next slide, please. You know, here's an example of additional guides and tools we provide different organizations. You know, we know that power might have a different priorities, such as like true resilience and true uptime. And so we've tailored the document towards power. Same thing with mobile, may have different priorities. And I mentioned our policy templates, and of course, we give some living off the land guidance. We know a lot of attacks these days are using living off the land, those services. And we know that for some people, you have to use RDP because people are working remotely, perhaps. And so it's not just turn it off, it's how can you use that in the most secure way possible. Next slide, please. Here's an example of all the different policy templates we have, and you can, I can provide a copy of my slides in like a PDF format if you guys want this. You don't have to memorize all these. Next slide, please. And then we also have a control self-assessment tool, right? So it's like, I guess, you know, when we talk about our ecosystem, it's, you know, guidance, how do I implement? And of course, you know, how can I show compliance? And then of course, how is it that I can assess? So we have Two kinds. We have a free one, which we host in our Amazon cloud, but then there was demand for, hey, I don't want to keep my data in your cloud. And then of course, some organizations like an MSP wanted a multi-tenanted version of CSAT, and that's the paid for version. You have to become a Secure Suite member, and that's how we are self-sustaining here at CIS, and that's called CSAT Pro. This is a true self-assessment tool. Organizations will say, this is how well I'm implemented this safeguard. This is how I have, I have a policy. It's automated, not automated. Next slide. It shows you a little bit of a more detail. You can select your implementation group, as well as it's federated in some sense where you can assign different organizations different parts of the tool to respond to. For example, one of the controls is security awareness training. Perhaps that's managed by HR and not the cybersecurity folks or the IT folks. So you can assign HR that control, as well as in the CSAT hosted, we have organizations will self-select their vertical. I'm healthcare, I'm, whatever, manufacturing. And then what you see is a comparison of you against your peers. And we see many organizations tracking their performance over time. So what you can do is like, okay, some organizations that are more mature are doing a self-assessment every month, others are every quarter or yearly, and you can track your performance, how well you did since the last time that you've actually done an assessment. Next slide. And here's what it looks like. That kind of spider web graph is one is the external one is this is how your peers are performing on that control, and the internal one, of course, is perhaps how you are doing. Next slide. And so really, regardless of what cybersecurity framework you choose, like I said earlier, choose one that'll answer the questions that you need answered. And so we've compiled a list of all the different questions. And here on the right-hand side is how we've tried to answer that. And I want to point out that it's not just internal tooling, right? We work with external tool vendors, external training service providers to say, hey, can you provide this training on controls for organizations? Can you put this in your tooling so that organizations that have, for example, Tenable, those big enterprise tools, or perhaps even like, we've been working with a lot of MSP tool service providers, tool vendors to get controls in their assessments or their dashboards. Next slide. So in summary, implementing controls allows enterprises to show, really in a court of law, that they're implementing reasonable cybersecurity. We have the ecosystem so that organizations can implement, assess, and measure against our controls. And then there's a URL to all our guidance. And are there any questions?
We have a lot of questions here, so
Okay.
let's start bringing it up. And thank you so much. This is a great overview of the CIS program, and I'm sure everybody found it helpful. Let's see. We've got just a simple one. What does ISAC stand for?
Oh, sorry. Information Sharing and Analysis Center.
There we
And
go.
so every vertical has an ISAC. And just as a little history, they're recognized by DHS, right? And so what's the importance of an ISAC is if you actually officially join an ISAC, and it's designed to for organizations within there, like FS-ISAC, Financial Sector ISAC, to share threat information. And then if you're a member of the ISAC and you share your information, or maybe you share like, hey, here's the firewall rule, or here's whatever, the mitigation, you're not legally, I guess there's legal protection so that if you share something and it doesn't work in someone else's organization, they can't sue you and things like that. And then of course, you're officially recognized by the government.
Great. As a very small MSP, I've heard via some talks about CMMC that we can focus on applying the controls to the bucket container that has the targeted data versus applying some of these to every client or in your entire business. Is that a correct line of thought? My thought is he's going say this is about scoping. This is about limiting the scope of an assessment. If I can interject that.
I see. I mean, I am not intimately familiar with CMMC. I would say that sounds reasonable to me, but you would really have to show it. You would really have to say, here's the data. Here's where the data resides, and it
Yeah.
only resides over here, right? And it doesn't travel over there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Documenting that scope, make sure there's a data flow
Yes.
diagram, things like that, that, you know, you hit all the bases where the data would exist. So,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, the recordings will be available. We mentioned that. Okay. How often do you expect to update versions? 8.0, 8.1, 8.2, etc.?
We try to not update them very frequently because we understand, it used to be before I came on board every other year. And then I started hearing from organizations. I just started my implementation and now you've updated, from 5.0 to 6.0 to 7.0. So 8.1 really was to stay in line with the NSITSP and the addition of the govern function. I do not predict any other kind of 8.2 or 8.3. The team is looking at a 9.0, but there has to be a really good reason, like a really major tipping point that we would go to the next version because it is such major work for organizations to go from one version to another. And we understand that. So I can't say there's not any really regular cadence. It's more, did we make a mistake or are we missing something or did something major happen that we have to add a new control? So for example, in controls version 8, we added a control on service providers, service provider management, right? Because we get to that tipping point where so many organizations are hybrid or they're using, SaaS and tools and all these things.
Right. You mentioned the hospital that was hit because they weren't following CIS controls. Was that a HIPAA breach or other problem?
I can't recall. I read that article a while ago, but it was actually a class action lawsuit brought to that hospital. And they mentioned CIS controls as well as NSITSP as two cybersecurity frameworks that hospital failed to implement. But yeah, personal data was leaked, but I don't know. It probably was a HIPAA violation, quite honestly. So
Right. Do you have an opinion on compliance as a service products? I'm assuming they're talking about GRC tools that MSPs can use to track their own clients' compliance. Any products that
oh,
you
no, I do not.
and we at NSITSP we try to stay away from we try to stay product agnostic. So
Same.
but there are a
It's all
lot
my
out
government training.
exactly.
You
There
can't show
are a lot
favoritism in
out
the
there.
marketplace.
Yeah, and there are a lot out there. So do your research, and there are plenty of out there that MSPs can use. Are IGs inclusive? So if you have IG2, have you already attained IG1? Uh,
Yeah, so implementation group 1 is the smallest, and we recommend all organizations start there. Implementation group 2 is comprised of IG1 and then those 74 additional ones. And then, of course, implementation group 3 is all of them. So, inclusive, yeah, I mean, yes, start with IG1 and try to get those done. However, if you're looking to IG2, that's 74 additional, right? And so, do a risk assessment, do a CIS RAM or whatever risk assessment you have to say, this is how I could prioritize those next ones. And you'd be surprised to see that a lot of things in IG2, you kind of get for free because you've already implemented it because of your tooling, right? So for example, many organizations will have already done like perhaps role-based access control or these other things that seem a little bit more comprehensive than IG1. And we look at our CSAT hosted results and kind of see that, like we'll say, oh, centrally manage accounts or centrally manage these things. And then we'll see that a lot of organizations are already doing that. So.
Does CIS have any integration/resources mapping to security architecture frameworks such as zero trust architecture? I'm reading through white papers and books on this topic, and it seems a lot of existing frameworks are based on the existing paradigms, which is trust, or perhaps some of zero trust principles are baked into the controls themselves.
So many of the controls have zero trust baked into them. And so, I am on the hook to write a blog post about that. So thank you for the push and the reminder. I mean, yes, they're baked into it, just like you said.
All right. How realistic is it for an SMB for about 50 people and no dedicated IT staff to implement all safeguards? Or is that something where you would implement the most reasonable controls possible for the organization?
So honestly, if there's an SMB with 50 people and no dedicated IT staff, I would say go see an MSP. Run, and see a service provider, right? I think if you have no IT expertise, I think it'll be really hard just in general to implement anything, right? I mean, you will not understand what we're saying. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of documents and you would have to read them, but I think it would be very difficult to say, okay, now you have to, have, does that person even know where to go to implement password policy? Does that person even know how to say, okay, what is a hardware asset inventory list? What's an IP address? All these things. Like, I think that's a big lift for any organization with zero IT expertise.
Yeah.
And I would just say, okay, then you better just pay for that service.
Right. A lot of this in chat is kind of veering off from questions, so I'm going to see if there's any other that are simple. We are running into our time frame here pretty quickly, so I think that's it for questions. So I'm going to flip. I've just got a few closing things I want to do for NSITSP. So I'm going to end this show and go back to mine. All right. So everybody, again, thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. Phyllis, it was really a pleasure having you here. Very informative. And we'll work on getting these slides in a PDF format for people that joined us today or couldn't make it. Now, if you are interested in becoming a member of NSITSP, please come to nsitsp.org/join. You'll see what the options are. Basic membership is free, and then there's a paid option that will give you more involvement in the organization. A few other great links that you can find here are the events. This event will be on that event page, but we've had previous events, and the entire cyber series will continue to be added to that over time. And then the recorded events under member resources. So please take a look at that. Please consider joining if you're not already a member. And please join us next month for CMMC. What does that mean for MSPs? That'll be Joy Beeland from Summit 7. She's an expert in the industry, been going through CMMC assessments. She's been running their own assessment through Summit 7, and they help a lot of other organizations achieve CMMC certification. So please join us on Wednesday, February 25th at noon Eastern Time for that. And you can register at the nsitsp.org/events location. And then finally, again, if you're not a member or if you are a member of NSITSP, please join us for our all members meeting, our Q1 2025 meeting on February 12th at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. And come and join. It's open to all, even non-members. If you're curious about what we do here at NSITSP, please join us and find out a little bit more about the organization. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. And again, thank you, Phyllis, for your participation and for everything you've brought to us today. It's been really, really enjoyable.
Thanks for having me. Bye now.